My name is Diana Moore. I am 68 years old, and for most of my life, I was the quiet foundation beneath other people's triumphs. I built a clothing company from the ground up, stitched from long nights at a sewing machine and endless days carrying bolts of fabric across factory floors. I sold that company for $40 million just months ago. But you would never have guessed that if you saw me the night my only daughter Rachel stood at the center of her glittering engagement party and screamed at me to stay away. It was supposed to be a celebration. Rachel had invited over 200 guests, the kind of people who measured their lives in polished shoes and champagne glasses. I arrived with a small box in my hands, a necklace of pearls from Tiffany's. I had saved it for years, waiting for the right moment to give it to her. My fingers held it tight because I knew it symbolized not money, but the countless sacrifices behind it. As I stepped into the hall, the music dimmed, conversations stilled. Rachel looked at me from across the room, her dress glowing under the chandeliers. For one breath, I thought I saw the little girl I once tucked into bed, the child who used to press her cheek against mine and whisper, "You are the best mom in the world." But that vision disappeared in an instant. Her lips curled with disdain. "Stay away from my wedding," she shouted, her voice rising above the violins. "You are miserable. You embarrass me. Get out of here, nobody." The crowd gasped. Champagne glasses froze in midair. Someone laughed under their breath, a cruel little sound that sliced through me more sharply than the words themselves. Ethan, her fiancé, stood by her side with a smug smile, as if he had been waiting for this humiliation to unfold. Barbara, his mother, leaned closer to Rachel, nodding in approval, her eyes never leaving me. I wanted to speak. My throat burned with every memory of years spent working 3 jobs, the nights I skipped meals so Rachel could eat better. But I realized that no defense, no pleading, would change the script that had already been written in her mind. To her, I was nothing but an old woman in a plain brown dress, someone who no longer belonged to her new polished world. So I did not argue. I did not beg. I simply placed the small blue box on the nearest table and whispered the only words that came to me. "All right, honey." The silence that followed was deafening. Then the laughter came, soft at first, then swelling. "Poor woman," someone muttered. "How pathetic." I walked through the sea of eyes that cut me open without lifting a hand. Each step felt like crossing a desert of betrayal. My heels clicked against marble floors like a clock ticking away the final seconds of a life I had once lived for her. Outside, the night air was bitterly cold. I wrapped my coat around me, though it did little to stop the trembling. The chauffeur opened the door, expecting me to collapse in tears. But I only sat upright, staring through the glass as the lights of the hall blurred behind me. I was not weak. I was awakening. The next morning, I packed 3 suitcases and left the country. Zurich was waiting. High in the Swiss Alps stood a villa I had purchased quietly years earlier, hidden behind layers of investment companies. Few knew of it. Rachel certainly did not. While she celebrated her new life without me, I sat by the fire in my mountain home, papers spread across the desk, plans falling into place. Rachel thought she had erased me from her story. She thought she had buried me under shame and silence. But she did not know who I truly was, or what I had built in the shadows of sacrifice. She did not know that every dollar of her education had come from the very hands she now dismissed. 3 weeks later, she would find herself standing at my door, her world collapsing, her pride shattered. And she would discover that the mother she had called miserable was the very woman holding the keys to her future. I was not always a woman standing alone at the edge of a crowded ballroom. There was a time when my life had rhythm, purpose, and the soft laughter of a child echoing through the rooms of a modest house. I remember the smell of fabric dye, the hum of sewing machines, and the feel of calloused fingertips that never seemed to heal. That was the beginning, the roots of everything I later built. I married young, to a man named Thomas Moore. He was kind but fragile, a dreamer who spent his evenings sketching blueprints for houses he never had the money to build. He died before Rachel's 5th birthday, leaving me with a mortgage, a child, and nothing more than a second-hand sewing machine. I could have folded then. Many thought I would. But when I looked at Rachel's sleeping face, cheeks flushed with innocence, I told myself I would not let her grow up believing we were less than anyone else. The first dresses I made were stitched on our kitchen table. I sold them at neighborhood fairs and through small boutiques. My neighbors whispered that I was wasting my time, that sewing was not a business, only a hobby. They did not see me hunched over the machine at 2 a.m, patching together scraps of fabric, or the blood on my fingertips when the needle pricked too fast. I told myself it was temporary, just enough to cover groceries, just enough to buy Rachel shoes for school. But the orders kept coming. 1 boutique became 3. 3 became a contract with a department store. I never advertised. I never had time for fancy storefronts or glossy campaigns. I let the quality of my work speak. I hired other women, single mothers like me, women who knew what it meant to stretch $1 across an entire week. We worked together in a small factory that smelled of starch and hope. Slowly, the name Moore Apparel began to carry weight. I kept my life simple. I lived in the same modest apartment, drove the same car until it sputtered its last breath. Every extra dollar went into Rachel's future. I remember the day the acceptance letter from Harvard arrived. She was 17, her hands trembling as she ripped open the envelope. She screamed with joy and leapt into my arms. I had never felt so proud, but I also knew the tuition bill that would follow. So I sold the small condo I had finally managed to buy, trading security for her dreams. I told her we could always find another place to live. Education was irreplaceable. Rachel never knew how close I came to losing everything during those years. There were months when payroll barely balanced, when banks called demanding payments I could not make. But each time, I found a way. Another investor convinced, another line of credit extended, another night without sleep. What mattered was that Rachel never felt the weight of those struggles. She wore the finest uniforms, carried new books, studied abroad during summers, all while believing her mother was just an ordinary seamstress making ends meet. In my silence, I carried the truth. That truth was that I had built an empire from fabric and willpower. Yet, the more I succeeded, the less I wanted to reveal. Perhaps I feared that Rachel would grow entitled. Perhaps I wanted her to love me for the sacrifices, not the numbers in my bank account. Or perhaps I simply forgot how to speak of my own worth. Looking back, I wonder if my silence was a mistake. By hiding the weight of what I carried, I allowed Rachel to believe it was light. She saw the plain dresses I wore, never knowing that behind them were financial ledgers thick with profits. She saw a tired mother and assumed poverty, not strength. Now, as I sit recalling those years, I realize how quickly love can be rewritten when truth is hidden. I thought my silence protected her. In reality, it built a distance that one day would split open like a fault line, shaking the foundation of everything I had built. When I think back on those years of struggle and quiet triumph, there is one person who always stood at the edges of my story, not loud, not demanding, but steady. Her name is Helen Carter. She has been my friend for over 4 decades, ever since we met in a church basement at a support group for widows. I was 30 years old, raw with grief, clutching Rachel on my lap. Helen was older by a few years, already weathered by life, her husband taken in an accident at the steel mill. She reached across the circle, placed her hand on mine, and whispered, "You'll survive this. Not because it's easy, but because you have to." Helen became more than a friend. She became my mirror. When I was too exhausted to see my own reflection clearly, she reminded me of who I was. She never sugarcoated the truth. If I looked ragged, she said it. If I was working myself into the ground, she scolded me. But she also sat with me through long nights when I thought the business would collapse, making tea in chipped cups and telling stories from her childhood until I could breathe again. Rachel grew up with Helen in her periphery. She called her Aunt Helen, though there was no blood between them. Helen remembered birthdays, showed up to graduations, and once even sold her own jewelry to help me cover a payroll shortfall. She said it wasn't charity. "It's an investment in you, Diana," she insisted. "I know what you're building, even if nobody else does." The truth is, Helen saw through me in ways Rachel never did. She noticed the quiet ledgers, the discreet trips to the bank, the long hours I refused to explain. She never pried, but her eyes told me she understood I was protecting something larger than myself. And when the time came for me to sell the company, she was the only person who knew the exact figure, $40 million. I still remember the way she exhaled, slow and steady, as if she had been carrying the weight with me all along. Helen's own life was modest. She lived in a small brick house with peeling paint, tended her garden with hands that still bore the roughness of factory work. She never remarried, never had children of her own. Perhaps that is why she poured so much care into Rachel. She treated her as family, though she was careful not to overstep. But as Rachel grew older, I began to notice the subtle tension. Rachel sometimes rolled her eyes when Helen offered advice, sometimes dismissed her with a sharp tone. I always wondered if Rachel resented the closeness Helen and I shared, the way Helen seemed to understand me in a way she did not. It was Helen who first warned me about Ethan, long before the engagement party. "There's something too polished about him," she said one evening, sipping tea in my kitchen. "His smile doesn't reach his eyes. Be careful, Diana." I brushed it off at the time, telling myself she was being protective, maybe even cynical. But Helen had lived long enough to smell trouble before it announced itself. The night Rachel screamed at me to stay away from her wedding, Helen was the first to arrive at my door. She found me sitting in silence, still wearing the plain dress Rachel had mocked. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. She simply set down a loaf of bread she had baked that morning, poured me a glass of water, and said, "You are not what they call you. You never were. Don't let their voices decide your worth." Her words landed with the kind of weight that silence cannot carry alone. They reminded me that even if my daughter no longer saw me, someone did. Someone always had. Helen became, in that moment, not just a friend, but a witness. someone who would hold the truth of my life when the lies of others tried to bury it. And though Rachel's rejection carved a hollow in me, it was Helen's steady presence that kept me from collapsing into it. The morning after the engagement party, I hoped, foolishly perhaps, that Rachel would call, to apologize, or at least to explain. I checked my phone again and again, but it stayed silent. By noon, the silence broke, not with her voice, but with a message that appeared like a blade pressed against my chest. Mom, please do not come to the wedding. This is my day. I don't want people seeing you in your plain clothes, pretending to belong. You'll only embarrass me. I'm serious. Stay away. I read the words over and over until they blurred into nothing but shapes on a glowing screen. I wanted to believe she had written them in anger, that the cruelty was temporary. But the precision of the sentences told me otherwise. Each word carried the chill of deliberate intention. I set the phone down carefully, as though handling something fragile, though what was truly breaking was not the device, but me. I walked to the small dresser in my bedroom. Inside the top drawer lay the blue box with the pearl necklace I had brought to the party. I had imagined fastening it around Rachel's neck on her wedding morning, whispering blessings in her ear, reminding her that no matter how far she went, she would always have me. Now it lay unopened, rejected without a glance. I lifted it from the drawer, turned it over in my hands, and then placed it back. The sound of the drawer sliding shut echoed through the room like the closing of a door I could never reopen. That afternoon, Helen came by. She carried a bag of groceries, though I had not asked her to. Her eyes fell on the phone lying face up on the table, the message still glowing. She didn't pick it up. She didn't need to. She simply asked, "So, she's made her choice?" I nodded. The words caught in my throat, too sharp to swallow, too dangerous to speak. Helen poured us both tea and said nothing else. In that silence, I felt both the cruelty of Rachel's decision and the comfort of having someone who bore witness to it. The days that followed were filled with preparations I was not part of. I walked past bridal shops, seeing dresses displayed in windows, mannequins draped in lace and silk. I wondered if Rachel had chosen something extravagant, if Barbara had guided her hand to select something worthy of the Carter family's image. Each window I passed felt like a mirror reflecting the life I was locked out of. Invitations went out, though none reached my mailbox. Neighbors whispered about the grand event, about how lucky Rachel was to marry into a family of means. They assumed I would be proud. They did not know I was forbidden. I smiled politely when they spoke, even as the knowledge hollowed me out. One evening, I received another message, not from Rachel, but from Barbara herself. It was brief, precise, and dripping with superiority. "Mrs. Moore, I trust you will honor Rachel's wishes. This wedding is a gathering of people with influence and refinement. It would be unfortunate if appearances were disturbed. Do stay away." I stared at the message, then deleted it. I did not reply. My silence was my shield. Words could be twisted, but silence carried its own weight. On the night of the rehearsal dinner, I sat by my window, listening to the faint hum of traffic. I pictured Rachel surrounded by laughter, clinking glasses, music swelling around her. I wondered if she thought of me at all, or if she had neatly cut me out of her story. Perhaps that was easier for her, pretending I was never part of the foundation she stood on. When the wedding day arrived, I did not dress in black, as if mourning. Instead, I wore a soft blue blouse and sat in my kitchen, sunlight streaming across the floor. I brewed tea, set 2 cups out, and waited for Helen. We drank in silence, the clink of porcelain the only sound. I felt pain, yes, but also a strange calm. My daughter had erased me from her grandest moment, yet I still existed, still breathing, still strong enough to sit upright. That in itself felt like defiance. A few days after Rachel's message, I found an envelope slipped under my apartment door. At first, I thought it might be a note from a neighbor, but the elegant handwriting across the front told me otherwise. Inside was a single sheet of stationery embossed with the Carter family crest. The words were written in sharp, deliberate strokes, each one carrying the kind of authority that expected no reply. Mrs. Moore, it is with respect for Rachel's happiness that I write to you. We both know weddings are not only about love, but also about presentation. Our family is well regarded, and we must maintain that standing. I urge you to consider Rachel's future carefully. Sometimes distance is the greatest gift a parent can give. For Rachel's sake, please refrain from attending the ceremony. Respectfully, Barbara Carter. I read the letter 3 times. The first time with disbelief, the second with anger, simmering low in my chest, and the third with a strange calm. Barbara had not asked. She had instructed. Her words were not a plea for harmony. They were a command wrapped in polite language. She had taken my daughter's rejection and dressed it in lace and etiquette, making cruelty look like refinement. That evening, Helen sat across from me at my kitchen table. I slid the letter toward her. She read it silently, her jaw tightening as she reached the end. "So this is how they do it," she muttered. "They push you out with politeness, then call it dignity. Diana, don't you see? They want Rachel without you. They want the pedigree of her education, the sparkle of her youth, but none of the woman who made those things possible." Her words were harsh, but they rang true. I sipped my tea, letting the bitterness linger on my tongue. "I gave everything for her," I whispered. Not to Helen, not even to the room, but to myself. I sold my first home so she could study. I lived in shadows so she could walk in light. And now they call me an embarrassment. Barbara's letter sat between us, like a stone. I could almost hear her voice as I imagined how she would have spoken those same words in person. Calm, cool, every syllable dripping with superiority. I pictured her standing tall, pearls at her throat, judging me not for who I was, but for who she believed I wasn't. In her world, a woman like me, plain, self-made, carrying scars of work, had no seat at the table. The next day, Rachel called. Her voice was not soft with apology. It carried the same clipped rhythm as Barbara's letter. "Mom, Barbara is right. Please understand. This wedding isn't the place for you. I need you to respect my choice. You've done enough for me. I have a new life now, a prosperous life, and, frankly, your presence would complicate things." I listened without interrupting. Each word struck, but I kept my silence, the kind of silence that grows heavier than shouting. Finally, I said only, "I hear you." She waited for me to argue, to fight for a place in her story. But I gave her nothing. The silence was my only answer. That night, I stood at the window, city lights flickering like distant stars. I thought of Thomas, of the promise I had made to him in the quiet of the hospital when he was slipping away. I had sworn I would raise Rachel strong, educated, free. I had kept that promise, but I never imagined that freedom would mean freedom from me. Barbara's letter remained on my dresser for days. Sometimes I considered tearing it to pieces. Other times I thought of framing it, a reminder of how people can disguise cruelty as grace. In the end, I tucked it into the same drawer as the pearl necklace, beside the blue box that had never been opened. Two objects side by side. One symbolizing love rejected, the other authority imposed. Both telling me the same story. I was no longer welcome. The night after Barbara's letter and Rachel's final call, I found myself sitting alone at the small oak desk in my apartment. The lamp cast a yellow circle of light across the surface, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. Outside, the city hummed with weekend noise, but inside, there was only silence. I poured myself a cup of tea, though I barely touched it. The steam rose and disappeared, just as my illusions had. I pulled open the drawer where I kept the things no one else ever saw. Inside were envelopes, folders, and a leather-bound notebook filled with years of calculations. I spread them across the desk, each piece of paper telling a story Rachel had never cared to hear. Property deeds, stock certificates, bank statements marked with balances she could not have imagined. The figures lined up like soldiers, millions upon millions, carefully guarded, silently multiplied. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the evidence of a life I had built with nothing but my two hands. $40 million. The number looked unreal on the page, as though it belonged to someone else. To the world outside, I was a woman who wore plain clothes, who lived in a modest apartment, who had little more than a sewing machine and old photographs. But here, under this lamplight, the truth gleamed brighter than any chandelier in Rachel's ballroom. Why had I hidden it? That question pulsed in my chest like a second heartbeat. I could have told her. I could have walked into that engagement party dressed in designer clothes, dripping with jewels, and shut every cruel mouth in that room. But I had chosen humility. I had chosen silence. I wanted Rachel to love me for my presence, not my wealth. I wanted her to know me as the woman who held her through nightmares, not the woman who balanced portfolios in the dark. Now that silence felt like betrayal of myself. By hiding my strength, I had allowed others to call me weak. By dressing simply, I had invited them to name me poor. And by never speaking of the empire I built, I had let my daughter believe I was a burden. I touched the pearl necklace still lying in its box, its sheen unbroken by her rejection. My fingers lingered on the smooth surface, and I thought of how pearls are formed. Layer after layer, built around an irritant, a wound. That was me. My fortune was my pearl, formed from years of grit and pain. And like the pearl, it was beautiful because of what it had endured. For the first time in decades, I allowed myself to cry. Not for Rachel, not for Barbara, but for the woman I had silenced within me. The tears came hot and fast, dripping onto the documents. I let them fall, each one carrying away a little of the shame I should never have felt. When they stopped, I felt lighter, as though the grief had burned itself out and left behind only clarity. I whispered aloud, though no one was there to hear me. No more. I will not let them define me again. At dawn, I called Mr. Green, my lawyer of 20 years. My voice was steady when he answered. "It's time," I said. "Prepare everything we talked about, the trust, the accounts, the properties. I want them secured beyond anyone's reach." He paused, then asked gently, "Are you finally going to reveal what you have?" "Not yet," I replied. "Not in the way they expect. First, I need Rachel to learn what she threw away. Then, when the moment is right, I will show them who I am." I ended the call and packed 3 suitcases with the essentials. Simple clothes, my documents, and the photograph of Rachel as a little girl, her arms around my neck, her smile pure. That photograph was my reminder of why I had endured so much. But it was also my reminder that love, when it turns cruel, cannot be allowed to destroy you. As the sun rose, I zipped the last suitcase. The city was waking, but I was already awake, more awake than I had been in years. The night of decision had ended, and with it, the woman who accepted humiliation without reply. Mr. Green had been my lawyer for more than 20 years. He was the only person who knew the full extent of my financial life. A discreet man in his 70s, always wearing the same gray suits and carrying a briefcase that seemed older than me, he had never once betrayed my trust. When I called him at dawn, I knew he would understand that the time for silence had ended. Later that morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a pen and a sheet of thick, cream-colored paper. Though I had spoken to him on the phone, I felt compelled to write, to set my intentions down clearly, as if putting ink on paper would anchor me to this new chapter. The letter was not long, but every word carried the weight of years. Dear Mr. Green, please proceed with the arrangements we have discussed in past meetings. Establish the trust in my name, secure the villa in Switzerland, and finalize the transfer of assets into accounts beyond dispute. It is my intention that none of these holdings be disclosed until the time I choose. I want Rachel to learn her lesson, not through inheritance, but through absence. She must face what it means to cut her mother out of her life. Ensure that legally, she cannot touch what she has rejected until she is prepared to acknowledge the truth of who I am. Yours sincerely, Diana Moore. I sealed the envelope, pressed it closed, and set it by the door. As I did, I felt a surge of clarity, as if each stroke of the pen had peeled away layers of doubt. This was no longer about money, it was about dignity. My fortune was not simply currency. It was the story of my resilience, and I would no longer allow it to be dismissed as if it were nothing. Mr. Green came to collect the letter that afternoon. He sat across from me, his glasses perched low on his nose, scanning the words I had written. When he finished, he folded the paper neatly and tucked it into his briefcase. Then he looked at me with an expression that was part admiration, part sorrow. Diana, he said quietly, I have seen many families torn apart by greed, but I must tell you, this is different. This isn't greed. This is blindness. Your daughter cannot see you, though you are standing right in front of her. And blindness can be more dangerous than malice. His words struck me deeply. I nodded, keeping my voice steady. Then she must learn to see, even if it takes years, even if it never happens at all. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. Are you ready for the storm that might follow? I have lived through storms before, I replied. This time, I will not bend. When he left, carrying my instructions with him, the apartment felt different. Not empty, but lighter. I walked to the window and looked out at the city below. Cars honked. People hurried along the sidewalks, unaware of the small revolution taking place in this modest room. For the first time, I felt the strange thrill of owning my story. Not hiding it, not apologizing for it, but claiming it with quiet resolve. That evening, I sat again at my desk, this time writing in my personal journal. I recorded everything. Rachel's cruel words, Barbara's polished threats, the decision I had made in the silence of night. It was not for anyone else to read, but for me, a record of the turning point. Someday, when I am gone, perhaps Rachel will find it. Perhaps she will see, finally, the truth she refused to acknowledge. I closed the journal, placed it beside the blue box with the pearl necklace, and turned off the lamp. My path was set. The next steps would not be easy, but they were mine to take. For the first time in many years, I felt the ground firm beneath my feet. The journal was still warm from my hand when the phone vibrated. I nearly let it ring. Then a voice with a careful accent said my name. "Mrs. Moore, this is Maria. I work for Ms. Rachel. I said I was listening." She drew in a breath. "I am sorry to call. I saw you at the party. I saw what happened. After you left, people laughed. The young man said you tried to crash a world that was not yours. Mrs. Carter said a wedding is no place for threadbare feelings." Maria paused, as if testing each word for danger. I could not sleep. The words would not sit quietly. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "You do not owe me this." "I am a mother too," she answered. "My daughter cleans offices at night so she can study during the day." When Miss Rachel spoke to you like that, I thought of what it would feel like if my own child forgot me once she had shiny friends. Even if you were poor, no one should be spoken to like that. She began to share small scenes only a housekeeper notices. Rachel practicing indifference in the mirror. Barbara correcting posture and tone as if tuning a violin. Ethan sliding envelopes face down whenever Rachel entered. "He leaves with a different cologne after lunch," Maria added. 2 times a week. I am not gossiping. I am telling you what I see. I heard the risk in every syllable. People like Barbara rely on silence from those who change linens and pour wine. Breaking that silence could cost Maria her job. "Please do not endanger yourself," I said. "You have responsibilities." "I know," she replied. "But truth is also a responsibility. Ms. Rachel told her friends that you push yourself into rooms where you do not belong. She said you cling to her because you have nothing of your own." The words were not new. Hearing them from a witness made them heavier. I let the quiet grow, not to punish, but to learn. Silence can be a refuge. It can also be a mirror. I looked into it long enough to see what I needed. "Maria, would you do one thing for me? Only if it is safe. Keep a small notebook. Write dates and what is said. Do not record voices. Do not confront anyone. Just write. If you stop feeling safe, stop." "I can do that," she said. "There is something else. Yesterday, a man brought papers to the apartment." Ms. Rachel signed some without reading. She looked pleased to be helpful. Mr. Ethan said it was routine vendor paperwork. I saw bank stamps. I have worked for families a long time. Vendor forms do not smell like loan documents. These did. A familiar worry moved through me, slow and cold. "You have already helped me more than you know," I said. "I am not helping for you alone," she answered. "I am helping for my girl, for the idea that mothers should not be thrown away when rooms get expensive. People think those who scrub floors are blind. We are not blind. We are simply told not to see." We ended the call with thanks. No promises. I sat at my desk with my palms flat on the wood. The city kept moving. Mine did not. Maria's courage placed a light at the end of a long hallway. It was not a spotlight, only a candle. But a candle proves there is a way forward. I opened a page and wrote a single line. "Witnesses exist, even when love fails." I added the date, underlined it, closed the notebook with both hands. Then I opened the drawer that held the blue box. The pearls were cool against my skin, smooth, patient. I returned them to their nest and shut the drawer. Not as surrender, but as practice. I was learning to close what no longer served me and to open what might. Maria's words lingered in my mind like smoke that refuses to clear. Ethan leaving with a different cologne, papers signed without Rachel's reading. These were not details to dismiss. They were seeds of a larger truth, a truth that had been hiding in plain sight. A week later, Helen brought me a newspaper clipping. She placed it on the table without a word. The headline was small, buried in the financial section, but my eyes caught it immediately. Carter Holdings, linked to questionable investments overseas. The article detailed shell companies, failed ventures, and whispers of fraud. Ethan's name was not printed, but Barbara's was, and I knew that where Barbara stood, Ethan was never far behind. I felt my chest tighten, not from shock, but from recognition. Maria had not exaggerated. Ethan was not the polished savior Rachel believed him to be. He was standing on sand, not stone. And worse, he was dragging my daughter into the quicksand with him. The following evening, Maria called again. Her voice was lower than before, strained with the risk of speaking. Mrs. Moore, I should not tell you this, but I must. Mr. Ethan has been meeting a banker in private. He jokes with his friends about Rachel's signature being worth more than her vows. He says she is his easiest investment. My hand gripped the receiver tighter. I closed my eyes, hearing Rachel's laughter as a child, the way she used to run into my arms after school. How could she be so blind now? And yet, hadn't I been blind too, once? Blind to how silence could grow into misunderstanding, blind to how wealth hidden becomes invisible even to those you love. Helen listened carefully as I recounted Maria's warning. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes sharp. Diana, you cannot save Rachel from her own choices, but you can protect what is yours. Don't let Ethan touch a single thread of what you built. Her words became the pivot in my mind. I realized then that Ethan's danger was not only to Rachel, but to the legacy I had poured my life into. If Rachel signed documents without reading them, what stopped Ethan from reaching for my company's remnants, my properties, my accounts? He would not just take my daughter's trust. He would strip her of her future and claim the pieces I had sacrificed to preserve. I called Mr. Green the next morning. My voice was firm. Tighten everything, I said. Every trust, every property. No signature of Rachel's should have any power over my estate until she understands what she is signing. Lock it all down. He hesitated. You're protecting her from herself. No, I replied, my throat tight but steady. I'm protecting what is left of me. If she chooses Ethan over truth, she must learn the cost. But I will not hand him the keys to my life's work. That night, as I folded laundry in silence, I felt the weight of the truth settling. Ethan was not simply arrogant. He was a predator cloaked in charm. Rachel did not see it yet, but she would. And when she did, she would remember my silence, not as weakness, but as the pause before revelation. I placed the folded clothes in the drawer beside the pearl necklace, a ritual that had become my private anchor. My fingers traced the smooth lid of the blue box as I whispered to myself, she called me miserable. He called me nobody. They do not know the story of these hands. Maria's voice echoed again in my memory. We are not blind. We are simply told not to see. But I was done being told. I saw Ethan now, clearer than Rachel ever had. And clarity, once found, cannot be undone. The weight of Ethan's deception sat heavily on my chest. But even heavier was the question of what to do with that knowledge. I found myself pacing the length of my apartment, tea cooling on the counter, the same question looping in my head. Was it my duty to protect Rachel, even if she had pushed me out? Or was this the very moment to step back, to let her stumble into the lesson she had chosen? It was a question no lawyer could answer, no ledger could solve. It was a question of motherhood, and motherhood is always tangled with sacrifice. I remembered the night she was born, the hospital lights harsh above me, Thomas holding her tiny body against his chest. He whispered, "She will need you more than she will ever know." I had carried that truth like a vow for 68 years. But what happens when the child no longer wants the mother? Helen and I sat together one evening, the pearl necklace between us like a silent witness. "You could tell her everything," Helen suggested. "Lay it out plain, the company, the villa, the millions. Show her who you are." I shook my head. "If I tell her now, it will sound like bargaining. She will think I'm buying her love back. That's not love. That's currency." Helen's eyes softened. "Then maybe the lesson isn't for her. Maybe it's for you. Maybe it's time you learned that you don't have to save everyone, even your own child." Her words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they rang true. For so long, my worth had been measured by what I gave: my time, my strength, my silence, my fortune. To stop giving felt unnatural, like cutting off my own arm. And yet, perhaps there was dignity in restraint. That night, I opened my journal and wrote 2 columns. On the left, I listed every reason to warn Rachel. She was my daughter, she was young, she did not see Ethan's trap. On the right, I listed every reason to stay silent. She had rejected me, she had chosen this path, and she needed to learn that actions carried consequences. The lists blurred together, ink smudged by the press of my hand. No answer appeared. Instead, a deeper question rose. What kind of mother am I if I let her fall? And what kind of woman am I if I keep letting myself be diminished for her sake? I thought of Maria, risking her job to speak the truth. I thought of Helen, steady as a lighthouse in every storm. Both women had shown me that dignity sometimes means letting silence speak. Maybe this was my test, my trial, not of wealth or power, but of restraint. I closed the journal and walked to the window. The city glittered below, each light a story, each window a life unfolding with its own joys and betrayals. How many other mothers, I wondered, stood at windows like this, asking themselves if love meant stepping in or stepping back? As the night deepened, I chose neither side of my list. Instead, I chose a line between them. I would prepare everything, secure everything, but I would not reveal it yet. I would let Rachel live her choice, even if it cut me. And if the day came when she saw Ethan for who he was, when she remembered the woman she had cast aside, I would be ready, not to punish, but to stand as proof that silence does not equal weakness. The choice did not feel heroic. It felt like breaking, but breaking into something cleaner. My test was not whether I could save my daughter. It was whether I could face myself in the mirror after choosing not to. When I finally lay down to sleep, the answer remained fragile, uncertain. But I knew one thing with clarity. This was my trial, and passing it would not mean winning. It would mean enduring. The first photographs of Rachel's wedding appeared online before the ceremony was even finished. I hadn't sought them out, but Helen, ever protective, insisted I see. She brought her tablet and placed it on my kitchen table, her finger trembling as she scrolled. There was Rachel, radiant in a gown that shimmered under chandeliers, her veil flowing like a river of silk. Ethan stood beside her, polished in a tailored suit, his arm draped around her waist like a man claiming a prize. Guests filled the hall, glasses lifted high, the air practically glowing, with money and approval. Every detail screamed extravagance. Flowers imported from Holland, crystal goblets, a band flown in from New York. I studied the photographs, searching not for beauty, but for truth. I found it in the corners of her smile, a tightness in her jaw, a flicker in her eyes that the cameras could not disguise. Rachel was dazzling, yes, but she did not look free. She looked rehearsed, as though every movement had been choreographed, as though Barbara and Ethan had written her lines. Helen muttered, "They've bought her a stage, but a stage is not a home." I said nothing. My silence was heavy, but it was not empty. Inside me, a storm moved. I had given her a life where choices were possible, where she could have walked her own road. Yet here she was, standing under chandeliers that blinded her from the truth, repeating vows written in a language of appearances. The next day, Maria called again. Her voice was hushed, as if walls had ears. "The wedding was beautiful, Mrs. Moore, but beauty does not hide everything." After the guests left, Mr. Ethan argued with a man in a dark suit. I overheard enough to know it was about money. He said the wedding was a show to calm investors. He said Rachel's name gave him credibility. That is all she is to him. Credibility. Her words did not surprise me. They confirmed what I had seen in Rachel's eyes. She was not a bride loved for who she was. She was an asset, dressed in lace. That evening, I lit a candle and sat with my journal. I wrote, "Extravagance cannot fill emptiness. A woman's worth is not in chandeliers or silks, but in the truth she dares to face." I underlined the words slowly, as though etching them into stone. Helen poured us both tea and broke the silence. "Do you regret not going?" I looked at her, then at the flickering candlelight. No, I would not have belonged in that room. My presence would have been another prop for their show. They would have paraded me as proof of what they had risen above. My absence was the only power I had left, and I used it. Helen nodded, her eyes glistening. "Then let them celebrate under their chandeliers. You built something more enduring than a single night." I thought of the factory floor, the women who had stitched beside me, the sweat and laughter woven into every seam. I thought of the villa in Switzerland, quiet in the mountains, waiting like a sanctuary. And I thought of Rachel as a child, barefoot in our small apartment, twirling in dresses I had made from leftover fabric. That girl still lived inside her, somewhere behind the polished smiles. When I closed the journal that night, I felt a shift inside me. The photographs of the wedding were not knives anymore. They were mirrors. They showed me not what I had lost, but what I refused to become. I would not be dazzled into blindness. I would not be bought by appearances. My silence was no longer passive. It was chosen, deliberate, strong. Rachel had her chandeliers. I had my candle. And sometimes, a single flame burns longer than all the lights in a ballroom. The morning of Rachel's wedding arrived with clear skies, as if the heavens had decided to bless her day with perfection. I sat at my kitchen table, sipping tea, my hands steady, though my heart was not. Outside, the city buzzed with weekend traffic, but my apartment was quiet, stripped of any trace of celebration. There were no flowers delivered, no hairdresser arriving, no bustle of bridesmaids. My invitation had been silence itself. I tried not to imagine the scene unfolding across town, yet my mind painted it anyway. Rachel stepping into her gown, lace brushing against the polished floor. Barbara fastening the final clasp of pearls around her neck, whispering approval that carried more weight than a mother's blessing. Ethan waiting at the altar, his smile calculated for photographers, his hand resting lightly on his cufflinks. Guests rising as the music swelled, gasping at the extravagance. Maria's texts arrived just as the ceremony began. Short sentences, discreetly typed from her corner as a server. She looks beautiful. She is nervous. Ethan is charming to the crowd. Barbara is orchestrating everything. I read them slowly, each line tightening the knot in my chest. Then one message stopped me cold. When the vows were read, Rachel's voice shook. She hesitated. Ethan pressed her hand harder. The crowd thought it was affection. I think it was pressure. I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply. I could see it as if I were there, my daughter, trembling, caught between the story she had been told and the truth she could not yet name. I longed to run to her, to pull her from the altar, to remind her that love is not supposed to feel like coercion. But the distance between us was not just measured in miles. It was measured in choices, hers and mine. Helen sat across from me, her presence solid as always. She reached for my hand. You're not there, Diana, but you're still her mother. Sometimes being a mother means standing outside the door, waiting for the knock that may never come. Her words steadied me. I picked up my pen and wrote in my journal, "She marries today. Not with freedom, but with performance. My silence is not abandonment. My silence is a boundary." Hours later, Maria sent one final update. They are married now. The hall erupted in cheers. Rachel smiled for the cameras, but when she thought no one was watching, her eyes were wet. I saw her mouth a word. "Mom." Just once, quickly, but I saw it. The letters blurred as tears filled my own eyes. It was the first acknowledgement of me since that cruel night at the engagement party. Even in rejection, even in pride, some part of her still reached for me. That single word, mouthed in secret, carried more weight than all the vows spoken aloud. I set my journal aside and lit a candle. The flame flickered gently, a quiet defiance against the chandeliers that surely sparkled above Rachel's head that day. In its glow, I whispered, "I am here. Even if you do not see me, I am here." Helen poured more tea, her silence saying more than words. Together we sat, two women outside the glitter of society, holding on to dignity like a shield. Rachel had walked down an aisle without me. She had chosen to begin her new life in the arms of a man who saw her as an investment. But I had chosen too. I had chosen not to fight for scraps of respect in a hall that denied my existence. I had chosen to preserve myself, to guard the legacy built with these hands, to stand tall even in solitude. And though my daughter's wedding day passed without me, I knew one truth with certainty. Love unrecognized does not disappear. It waits like a candle in the dark, steady and patient, until the one who rejected it remembers the warmth it once gave. While Rachel's wedding photographs spread across glossy magazines and online pages, another story was quietly unfolding in the same city. Carter Holdings, the empire Barbara so proudly flaunted, was coming under public scrutiny. I did not seek the headlines, but they arrived anyway, delivered in crisp black print on the morning paper that landed at my door. Carter family faces questions over overseas investments, the headline read. Subtext mentioned shell companies, tax havens, and losses hidden behind elegant language. I traced the words with my finger, feeling the weight of them, and wondered if Rachel had even noticed. Or had Ethan and Barbara assured her that such matters were beneath the concern of a new bride? Later that week, I turned on the television. A press conference was airing live. Barbara stood at a podium, immaculate as ever, flanked by Ethan and a team of lawyers. Her pearls gleamed beneath the flash of cameras. She spoke with confidence, dismissing the accusations as misinterpretations and technical oversights. Every word was measured, every smile crafted to soothe investors. Ethan, standing to her right, nodded with a smirk that only I seemed to notice. His hand brushed the microphone once as though eager to speak, but Barbara kept the stage. She was the conductor, and Ethan the instrument, playing whatever note she demanded. Reporters shouted questions, their voices clashing in the air. One cut through. Is it true that family members have been signing financial documents without full disclosure? Barbara's smile did not falter. Our family trusts each other completely, she said smoothly. We operate as one. I sat back in my chair, a bitter taste in my mouth. Trust, she said. I imagined Rachel's hesitant hand at the altar, the way Maria described Ethan pressing down to steady or control her. Trust was the word they used to mask manipulation. Helen watched with me, her lips pressed thin. They are spinning a story, she said. But stories like these have cracks. Eventually, light finds its way in. The screen cut briefly to audience shots. Among the crowd of reporters, I spotted a young woman holding a notebook. She raised her hand again and again, her persistence catching my eye. Finally, she was called on. What assurances can you give that Rachel Moore, now part of this family, is not being used as collateral for your debts? For the first time, Barbara hesitated. It was only a flicker, a pause, a tightening of her jaw. But I saw it. Ethan leaned forward, but the lawyer to his left whispered something and pulled him back. Barbara regained composure quickly. Rachel is a beloved member of this family, she said, her voice smoother than silk. Her happiness is our only concern. I turned off the television. The silence in the room roared louder than the conference had. Helen exhaled. They are protecting their image, not her. I walked to my desk and opened my journal. I wrote, They hold press conferences. I hold silence. They protect their wealth with words. I protect mine with truth. They parade trust. I preserve dignity. In that moment, I realized how parallel our worlds had become. Barbara orchestrated public performances, while I built quiet defenses behind closed doors. She played to cameras. I prepared for courts, for laws, for the unshakable evidence of documents. Her empire depended on appearances. Mine depended on resilience. As I closed the journal, I felt no envy for her stage. The spotlight that once might have tempted me now seemed like a trap. The true power was not in microphones or flashing cameras. It was in endurance, in the ability to wait while others spoke themselves into corners. Rachel's wedding had been a spectacle. Barbara's press conference was another. Both glittered, both drew applause. Yet both, I knew, were fragile. One gust of truth would scatter them like ashes in the wind. The morning after the press conference, the city buzzed with two competing stories: Rachel's perfect wedding and the cracks in the Carter empire. What no one outside the gilded halls knew was that those two stories were already colliding, destined to explode in the same room. I hadn't planned to attend the wedding reception. I had told myself that my presence would only deepen the wound. Yet, when Maria called and whispered what she overheard, the murmurs of forged signatures, the rumors of Ethan using Rachel's name on hidden loans, I felt a force pull me back. Not to make a scene, not to reclaim a seat at the table, but to witness what truth does when it finally shows its face. The ballroom sparkled with chandeliers, their crystal prisms scattering light across silk gowns and black tuxedos. A string quartet played softly, almost drowned out by laughter and champagne toasts. Rachel, radiant in her gown, tried to maintain her composure. But I saw it, the flicker of doubt behind her eyes. I recognized it because I once wore that same mask when I was younger, trying to convince myself that sacrifice was the same as joy. Ethan stood tall beside her, charming the guests with easy banter. Barbara, ever regal, orchestrated introductions like a queen presenting her heirs. They believed they had secured their narrative, that the conference earlier in the day had silenced questions. But whispers spread faster than applause. The reporters who had lingered outside were now texting guests inside. Screens lit up with headlines. The cracks widened, and the glitter began to look more like glass about to shatter. Then it happened. A guest, emboldened by wine and gossip, raised his phone during a toast. He read aloud the breaking news. Carter Holdings under federal investigation for fraudulent disclosures. The room froze. For a moment, even the violins faltered. Rachel's bouquet trembled in her hands. Ethan's smile stiffened, and Barbara's pearls seemed to weigh heavier around her neck. I was not standing near them, but I felt the energy shift. Conversations stilled, forks hovered mid-air. Some guests whispered, others quietly slipped out, unwilling to be photographed at what was turning into a scandalous affair. The ballroom, once a sanctuary of wealth and certainty, became a stage for doubt. Rachel's face turned pale as she glanced at Ethan. He placed a reassuring hand over hers, but she pulled away. That single gesture, small as it was, cut through the air like a blade. It was the first time she publicly separated herself from him, and Barbara saw it too. Her eyes narrowed, not in sorrow, but in calculation, as if already rewriting the narrative in her mind. The microphone screeched as a nervous best man attempted to continue the program. His words stumbled, hollow, ignored. The bride and groom were no longer the focus. The scandal was. Cameras that once captured Rachel's smile now captured the unraveling of a dynasty. I remained silent, tucked at the edge of the hall. My presence went unnoticed, and I preferred it that way. I had no desire to speak. Truth was already speaking louder than I ever could. My heart ached for Rachel, not because I wanted her back, but because I knew she had reached the edge of illusion. The world she thought she had chosen was collapsing before her, and collapse leaves scars. Helen leaned toward me and whispered, "You see? Sometimes you don't need to lift a finger. They build their own ruin." She was right. It wasn't my hand that tipped the scales. It was the weight of arrogance, of lies, of greed piled too high. All I had done was step aside, allowing gravity to take its course. As I watched Rachel excuse herself from the dance floor, gown brushing the marble like a ghost fleeing her own story, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and clarity. I had lost my daughter to pride and illusion long before this night. But perhaps, in the rubble of her chosen path, she might one day find the humility to seek her own truth. The music tried to recover, but the night was broken. The chandeliers still sparkled, but the magic had burned out. And as the laughter turned to murmurs, I knew the collapse of the wedding was more than social embarrassment. It was the first visible crack in a wall that had hidden rot for years. And once walls begin to crack, they never hold. After the ballroom fractured under the weight of whispers and headlines, the celebration limped to its bitter end. Guests left in clusters, murmuring like waves receding from the shore. The chandeliers still glowed, but their light felt harsh, exposing cracks rather than illuminating joy. I thought I would leave quietly, unnoticed as I had arrived, but fate had other plans. Maria found me first. She touched my arm gently, her eyes wide with urgency. "She's looking for you," she whispered. "Rachel." She slipped away from Ethan and Barbara. "She's in the bridal suite upstairs." For a moment, I hesitated. My instinct was to protect myself, to avoid another wound from a daughter who had told me I was no longer part of her life. But Maria's voice carried a plea, and beneath it, I sensed Rachel's desperation. So I followed. The suite was lavish, filled with discarded flowers, empty glasses, and the faint scent of champagne. Rachel sat at the edge of the vanity, still in her gown. Her hair, once perfectly styled, now drooped around her face, and her eyes were swollen from holding back tears. When she looked up and saw me, something broke inside her. "Mom," she whispered, the word trembling as if she hadn't said it in years. "You came." I stood near the doorway, not daring to move closer. "I didn't come for the wedding," I said softly. "I came to see the truth, with my own eyes." Her shoulders collapsed. She gripped the vanity like it was the only thing holding her upright. "Everything's falling apart," she admitted. "The news, the questions, Ethan's temper. None of this was supposed to happen." I wanted to rush to her, to hold her as I had when she was a child waking from nightmares. But I stayed still. Silence can be its own kind of embrace, one that forces honesty. Finally, she blurted out, "They told me you wouldn't understand, that you'd embarrass me, that you'd never belong in this world." She choked on her words. I believed them. The air in the room thickened. My hands trembled at my sides, but my voice remained steady. "And now?" I asked. Her eyes filled with tears. "Now I see they were using me. Ethan doesn't love me, Mom. He loves what I represent. And Barbara, she sees me as a pawn. I thought marrying him meant security, prestige. Instead, it feels like a cage closing in." I stepped closer, but not enough to erase the distance between us. "Rachel, when you shut me out, you believed the version of me they painted, that I was weak, poor, a burden. But the truth was always more complicated. I sacrificed so you could choose freely, but I never thought you'd choose against me." Her face crumpled. She reached out, fingers brushing the air as if begging me to meet her halfway. "I was wrong," she said. "I see it now. But is it too late?" I wanted to forgive her then and there, to wipe away the sting of years with one embrace. But forgiveness without growth is fragile. It breaks again at the first strain. So I let silence hang between us, forcing her to feel the weight of her choices. She sobbed quietly, her gown shimmering with every tremor. In that silence, I remembered the little girl who once wrote me notes on construction paper, promising to love me forever. I also remembered the young woman who told me I was an embarrassment. Both truths lived in her, and I could not erase one to honor the other. Finally, I said, "Whether it's too late or not is not for me to answer tonight. That's for you to decide, with your actions, not your words." Her sobs slowed. She nodded faintly, though her eyes still searched mine for comfort. I offered none. Not yet. Comfort is a gift, and she would have to earn it. When I turned to leave, she whispered, "Please don't disappear again." I paused at the door. "I never disappeared, Rachel. You just stopped looking." Then I left, my steps steady, carrying both the ache of motherhood and the quiet strength of a woman who finally refused to be diminished. When I left Rachel in the bridal suite, I thought I would return quietly to my hotel. But destiny, it seemed, wasn't finished with me that night. As I stepped into the marble corridor, I saw Ethan at the far end. His tie was loosened, his jaw tight with fury. He hadn't seen me yet. He was too busy whispering into his phone, pacing like a cornered wolf. I stopped in the shadows, listening. His voice was harsh, stripped of charm. "No, listen. The accounts have to be cleared before the investigators freeze them. I don't care how. Move the money tonight. Use Rachel's name if you have to. She'll sign anything." The words landed like daggers. My daughter wasn't just a wife to him. She was collateral, a shield for his empire of lies. I stepped forward deliberately, letting my heels echo against the marble. He turned, startled, eyes narrowing when he recognized me. "You," he spat, his charm dissolving. "Why are you even here?" I held his gaze, my voice calm, almost cold. I could ask the same. "Shouldn't you be celebrating your wedding instead of planning financial fraud?" His face flushed. He straightened, regaining a mask of arrogance. "You don't know what you're talking about. This is business. Complicated business. Something you, with your little sentimental stories, wouldn't understand." I walked closer until only a few steps separated us. "I understand enough. I understand that you've been using Rachel as a pawn, signing papers in her name, hiding debts under her future. She may not see it fully yet, but I do. And believe me, Ethan, silence doesn't mean blindness." He smirked, though I could see a flicker of unease in his eyes. "Even if that were true, who would believe you? You're the bitter mother who wasn't even invited to the wedding. I have the Carter name, the lawyers, the press. You have nothing." For a moment, I let the silence hang. Power lives in silence. Then I spoke, slow and deliberate. "You've mistaken me, Ethan. I am not nothing. I am the woman who raised Rachel, who built a business from nothing but grit and sacrifice. I know how to play the long game. And I don't need your stage to bring you down. The truth does the work for me." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Stay out of this, Diane. If you care about Rachel, you'll keep your mouth shut. Otherwise, when I go down, she goes down with me." My chest tightened, but not with fear, with clarity. This was his weapon: threats. He thought everyone could be controlled through fear of loss. I looked him in the eyes and said, "The only person going down here is you. Because unlike Rachel, I don't love you. I don't owe you loyalty. And I have people who have been watching, listening, collecting." His composure cracked. "You're bluffing." I allowed myself the faintest smile. "Am I?" At that exact moment, Helen appeared at the far end of the hall, holding her phone up. "Not bluffing," she said firmly. "I recorded every word you just said." Ethan froze, his face drained of color, his bravado collapsing into something rawer: fear. I turned slightly toward Helen, but kept my eyes on him. "You see, Ethan, arrogance makes men sloppy. You think no one's paying attention. But some of us have been paying attention our entire lives." He lunged forward as if to grab the phone, but Helen stepped back, her voice unwavering. Try it, and I'll send this recording to every reporter still downstairs." He stopped, fists clenched, breathing hard. I stepped between them, calm as ever. "This isn't the end, Ethan. It's the beginning. Rachel deserves to know the truth, and she will." He glared at me, hatred boiling in his eyes, but he didn't move. He couldn't. The power had shifted, and he knew it. As Helen and I walked away, I felt his stare burn into my back. But instead of fear, I felt something else. Resolve. For the first time in years, I was not just enduring. I was standing, firmly, in the light of truth. And Ethan Carter, for all his bravado, was already standing in the shadows of his own ruin. After Ethan's threats and Helen's recording, the air inside the hotel felt heavy, thick with the weight of secrets finally dragged into the open. Helen and I left the corridor, but I didn't go straight home. Something inside me, an instinct honed by years of surviving storms, told me to wait. Sometimes silence reveals more than words, and presence, even in the background, can speak louder than confrontation. I found a quiet corner in the lounge just below the bridal suite. The music from the reception had dwindled to a few scattered notes, the kind musicians play when no one is listening. Guests trickled out in hushed conversations, their designer shoes clicking across marble floors like faint metronomes marking the end of a failed performance. Sitting there, I wrapped my hands around a porcelain cup of tea. Its warmth anchored me. The cup had become a symbol in my life. Something fragile yet resilient. Something that could hold comfort even after being poured into 1,000 times. I stared into the steam, letting the noise of the hotel dissolve into background hums. Rachel appeared at the top of the staircase, her wedding gown now slightly wrinkled, her veil absent. She didn't see me, but I saw her, her steps hesitant, her eyes red-rimmed from tears she probably shed alone. She paused midway down the stairs as Ethan approached from behind, speaking low and harsh. Though I couldn't hear the words, I didn't need to. His posture, leaning in, dominating, her shoulders folding inward, shrinking beneath the weight of his presence. It said enough. I didn't interrupt. I didn't rise. I let the silence stretch between us, my gaze steady, but invisible. Rachel glanced toward the lounge at one point, almost sensing me, and for the briefest second, our eyes met. She froze, then quickly looked away, as though ashamed of what I had witnessed. But even in that fleeting glance, I saw a question. "Are you still here for me?" I didn't nod. I didn't smile. I let my stillness be the answer. Sometimes love is not loud reassurance. Sometimes it is simply staying when you have every reason to walk away. Ethan guided her away roughly, his hand pressing against her arm. My body tensed, but I did not chase them. My silence was not weakness. It was patience. Every predator eventually exposes himself, and every victim eventually recognizes the trap. My role now was to be present, not to rescue, not to argue, but to bear witness. Helen joined me at the table a few minutes later. She placed her phone face down and sighed. "You didn't say a word," she observed. "I didn't need to," I replied. "Do you think she saw you?" "Yes," I said softly. "And I think that's enough, for now." We sat in silence together, two women bound not by blood, but by understanding. Helen had her own history of betrayal and survival, and in that silence, our scars spoke louder than any conversation could. The lounge emptied until it was only us and a weary server collecting glasses. The hotel's grandeur, so dazzling hours earlier, now felt like a hollow shell. I finished my tea slowly, savoring its warmth like an anchor in stormy waters. As midnight struck, I rose to leave. Walking past the grand mirrors lining the lobby, I caught my reflection. My face bore lines of age and endurance, but also a steadiness I hadn't always recognized. I realized then that silence was no longer the silence of being ignored or dismissed. It was the silence of choice, of power withheld until the right moment. That night, I did not confront Rachel or Ethan again. I did not storm into their suite or expose their lies to the guests still lingering in curiosity. I simply left, letting silence settle around me like a cloak. For in that silence, Rachel would remember my presence. And one day, when the noise of Ethan's deception became unbearable, she would recall the quiet figure who waited in the shadows, not condemning, not rescuing, simply bearing witness. And sometimes, that memory is what saves us. The days that followed the wedding felt like a storm that would not pass. Newspapers splashed Barbara's polished smile on their front pages, framing it with bold headlines about investigations, financial irregularities, and public betrayal. Television anchors debated Carter Holdings every evening, some predicting collapse, others speculating about legal consequences. Every time I turned on the news, her empire looked less like marble and more like sand. Rachel, though, was nowhere to be seen. The photographs that had filled social media on her wedding day, her in a gown of ivory lace, Ethan's hand tightly clasping hers, were replaced with silence. No new posts, no smiling couple parading through magazines. Silence in the public eye is rarely accidental. It is a signal, a confession without words. Maria called me each evening, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone caught between loyalty and horror. "They're fighting constantly," she said. "Rachel cries most nights. Ethan yells, then disappears for hours. Barbara tries to hold everything together, but even she cannot keep up appearances anymore. The staff whisper about unpaid bills, about suppliers demanding money. It's all unraveling, Mrs. Diane. I've never seen anything like it." I thanked her, though my heart ached at every detail. It would have been easy to gloat, to tell myself they deserved this collapse after the cruelty they inflicted. But gloating never suited me. Instead, I sat quietly, sipping tea, reminding myself that truth has its own rhythm. It arrives not when we force it, but when it cannot be denied any longer. One afternoon, I received a letter. The envelope bore no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable, Rachel's. My hands trembled as I opened it. "Mom," it began simply. "I don't know if you'll even read this, but I need to write. Everything I thought was solid is crumbling. Ethan isn't the man I believed. He lied about money, about loyalty, about almost everything. And Barbara, she doesn't see me as a daughter, only as a pawn. I remember what I said to you. I remember the cruelty in my words, and I can't take them back. But please believe me. I regret them every day. If I could undo it all, I would. I don't expect forgiveness. I just don't want to feel like I'm alone in this world." Tears blurred the ink as I read. The girl who once held my hand crossing the street, the girl who used to tuck paper hearts into my purse, had resurfaced. But she was buried beneath shame, pride, and fear. I folded the letter carefully, placed it inside my journal, and whispered to myself, "She is not lost. She is only wandering." Still, I did not rush to her. Years had taught me that rushing to rescue can sometimes trap someone deeper in their illusions. Instead, I waited. Meanwhile, the Carter's empire continued to crumble. Regulators issued subpoenas. Former partners distanced themselves. Invitations that once poured into their home dried up overnight. The same society that applauded them now dissected them, piece by piece. Helen visited one evening. She set down a tray of bread and stew she'd made, and we ate in silence before she finally spoke. You see, Diane, empires built on deceit always collapse faster than anyone expects. You didn't need to shout. You didn't need to fight. You just had to outlast them. I nodded, though my mind was elsewhere. Outlasting was never my only goal. Healing, though slower, mattered more. For Rachel, for myself, for the years that had been scorched by betrayal. That night, I sat at my desk with a blank page before me. I considered writing Rachel back, offering comfort or advice, but the words would not come. Instead, I lit a candle, closed my eyes, and whispered into the flame. When she is ready, she will come. And when she does, I will be here. Not as her shield, but as her mirror. The scandal had stolen their glittering world. But in the ashes, I sensed something else stirring. A chance, however fragile, for truth to grow. And sometimes, truth is all we need to begin again. The letter Rachel had written me was the first crack in her armor. But what followed in the weeks ahead shattered it completely. The newspapers no longer bothered with delicate phrasing. Carter Holdings implodes screamed across headlines. Ethan's face appeared in handcuffs on the evening news, his once polished grin now replaced by the twisted snarl of a man cornered. Barbara, still in her pearls, tried to stand before cameras and declare everything a misunderstanding, but the world had stopped listening. Rachel, however, bore the cruelest weight. Maria told me first, her voice heavy with pity. They've frozen the accounts in her name. Everything Ethan pushed onto her, loans, mortgages, unpaid bills, it's all crashing down. She can't even keep the condo. The creditors have stripped the place clean. Furniture, jewelry, even her wedding dress left hanging in the closet. They've taken it all. I sat in silence, the words pressing into me like stones. I had known Ethan's betrayal ran deep, but I hadn't imagined how ruthlessly he had entwined Rachel's future with his debts. He hadn't just deceived her, he had buried her under the rubble of his greed. 2 days later, Helen stopped by with groceries. As we shelved the bread and apples, she shook her head. She's wandering the city like a ghost, Diane. I heard she tried to go back to Barbara, but the door was shut. Literally. Barbara told her she couldn't be seen with her anymore. Imagine that. Your own mother-in-law discarding you like yesterday's trash. A part of me flinched at the irony. Rachel had once told me to stay away from her life, that I embarrassed her. And now, the very people she had chosen over me had thrown her out without hesitation. But instead of satisfaction, I felt sorrow. There is nothing triumphant about watching your child unravel, even when her own choices pave the path. News reached me again through Maria. She's renting a single room now, she whispered. Barely enough space for a bed. She works part-time answering phones at a clinic. No friends visit her anymore. They only cared about the Carter name, not her. I thanked Maria, though my throat ached too much to say more. That night, I walked through my quiet home and touched the objects that had carried my memories. A framed photograph of Rachel at 6 years old, her gap-toothed smile radiant. The quilt I stitched during long nights while she studied. The porcelain cup I kept beside me like a faithful companion. Each item felt heavier, because each reminded me that love does not protect us from consequences. It only endures them. Weeks turned into months, and still Rachel spiraled downward. Once, Helen and I passed her on the street. She wore a plain coat too thin for the winter wind, her eyes downcast, her cheeks hollowed. She didn't see us, or perhaps she did and couldn't face us. Either way, I felt a stab of helplessness that no amount of endurance could dull. Helen murmured as we watched her disappear into the crowd. "She's lost everything." I answered quietly, "Not everything. She still has the chance to begin again, but she hasn't realized it yet." That night, I wrote in my journal, "Losing everything is sometimes the only way to discover what matters. But the discovery is cruel, and the price is high." I didn't reach out to Rachel, not then. I couldn't force her to see me, to admit she was wrong. That had to come from within her. Until then, my silence was not abandonment. It was the space she needed to hear her own heart. Still, I prayed, not for her to return to me, but for her to find herself again in the ruins. Because losing everything can also be the beginning of finding the truth. And Rachel, though she did not yet know it, had reached that threshold. There are nights when silence feels heavier than stone. Tonight was one of them. I sat alone in my study, the lamp casting a golden circle across my desk, everything else swallowed by shadows. The house was still, save for the faint ticking of the old clock on the mantel. In that quiet, words began to form inside me. Words I had never said aloud. Words I wasn't sure anyone would ever hear. And so I began to speak, though only the walls bore witness. I am Diana Moore, 70 years old, widow, mother, businesswoman, survivor. People call me many things, but none of those names have ever truly held me. What holds me are the choices I made and the sacrifices I carried like stones in my pockets. I rose from the chair and paced slowly, my hand trailing across the spines of books lined neatly on the shelves. Each one reminded me of a late night spent studying after Rachel had gone to bed, back when I believed knowledge would be my way out of struggle. I built a $40 million company from scratch, but when I walked into my daughter's engagement party, I was treated like a beggar at a banquet. My dress was too plain, my presence too inconvenient, my love too embarrassing. I was told to leave by my own child. The words still stung, even now. I closed my eyes and exhaled. It would be easy to say I hated her for that moment, but hate has no roots in me. What I felt was grief sharper than any knife, because you can bury a husband and still breathe. But when your child buries you alive in shame, what breath remains tastes like ashes. I paused at the window, looking out at the garden bathed in moonlight. The roses I planted years ago swayed in the night breeze, petals fragile yet persistent. I stayed silent. People thought my silence was weakness, but it was not. Silence is a kind of language. It says, I do not need to prove myself to you. I do not need to scream to be heard. Time will speak for me, and time has spoken. Ethan's empire crumbled. Barbara's reputation cracked. Rachel, my own flesh and blood, now walks alone in shadows she chose over me. I pressed a hand against my chest, where the ache never fully left. And yet, I am not free of her. A mother's heart is a paradox. It breaks, but it beats on. It longs, even when betrayed. I find myself asking questions I cannot answer. If she begged me tomorrow, would I open my arms? If she confessed her regrets, would I let her in? Or have I learned at last that love without respect is not love at all? It is self-destruction? I returned to the desk and opened my journal. Inside were Rachel's letters, scribbled apologies, half-formed sentences, words soaked in regret. I traced them with my finger, my throat tightening. She has lost everything. But maybe losing everything is what she needed. Maybe it is what I needed too. Because only when the noise is stripped away do we hear the truth of who we are. For a long moment, I let the silence answer me. Then, softly, I spoke again. I am Diana Moore. I am no longer an embarrassment. I am no longer invisible. I am a woman who built, who endured, who survived. And though I still ache for the little girl who once called me mommy with love, I cannot allow myself to be buried again. My silence is not surrender. It is survival. It is dignity. It is the one inheritance I can still give her. An example that you can lose everything others think matters and still stand tall. I blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. Yet in that darkness, I felt lighter, as though the act of speaking my truth aloud had lifted something from me. I walked toward the bedroom, whispering a final line into the night. Unconditional love is real, but so are boundaries. And sometimes, the truest act of love is refusing to be broken. The morning light crept gently through my curtains when I found the envelope. It had been slipped under my door sometime during the night, the paper slightly crumpled as if handled with hesitation. My name was written across the front in Rachel's hand, shaky, uneven, so unlike the elegant script she once practiced in her teenage journals. I stood for a long time before opening it, as though the letter itself carried a weight too heavy to bear. When I finally broke the seal, the words spilled into me like both wound and balm. "Mom," it began, "this will be the last letter I write you for a while. Not because I don't want to speak to you, but because I need to face what I've done without hiding behind paper. I need to walk into my mistakes with open eyes. But before I do, I want to leave these words with you, words I should have spoken long ago." Her sentences were raw, stripped of the pride that once armored her voice. I chose Ethan over you. I chose Barbara's approval over your love. And now I see that every choice was made on sand. When the tide came in, it washed everything away. I blamed you for being ordinary, when in truth, you were extraordinary. You built something real, something no storm could wash away. I told you to stay away from my wedding, and now I would give anything to see you sitting there, even in the back row, even in silence. I paused, letting the words pierce me. The ache was sharp, but beneath it was something else, an echo of the girl I once knew, the girl who made paper hearts for me on Valentine's Day and taped them to the refrigerator. Her letter continued. I am not asking for forgiveness, because I don't deserve it yet. I am only asking you to believe that I finally see the truth. You were never the embarrassment. I was. I let greed, pride, and fear blind me. I let Ethan use me as a shield, and I called it love. I let Barbara treat me like an ornament, and I called it belonging. And I let myself hurt you, the one person who never abandoned me, and I called it independence. I see now how wrong I was. My vision blurred as tears welled, but I forced myself to keep reading. I've lost everything, Mom. The condo, the friends, the image I clung to. It's all gone. But in losing it, I found a strange kind of freedom. I walk to work now. I buy my own groceries. I live in a single room, and it is mine. No one can take it from me, because no one gave it to me. For the first time, I feel the strength you must have felt when you built your life from nothing. I think I understand you now, even if it took me too long. Her closing lines were the hardest to read. If one day I can stand before you, not as your lost daughter, but as a woman who has rebuilt herself, I hope you will look at me and see not my failures, but my fight. Until then, I will keep this silence, not as punishment, but as promise. Promise that when I return, it will be as someone worthy of you." The letter ended there, her signature trailing like a whisper across the page. I folded it carefully, pressing it to my chest. My tears fell silently, staining the paper, but I did not sob. There was no despair in me now, only a deep, aching hope. I placed the letter inside my journal, alongside the others. But this one felt different. Not an apology, not a plea, a vow, a seed planted in barren soil, waiting for its season to bloom. As the morning sun warmed my hands, I whispered into the quiet, "I'll be here, Rachel. However long it takes, I'll be here." And for the first time in years, I believed those words could carry us both towards something new. 1 year later, the seasons had turned full circle. The roses in my garden bloomed again, their petals soft and fragrant, reminding me of the passage of time. A year ago, my heart felt like those roses in winter, stripped bare, vulnerable, waiting for a spring that seemed impossible. Yet here I was, standing in sunlight, the air cool against my face, my hands stronger for having carried sorrow without letting it crush me. The scandal that once consumed the papers had faded into yesterday's news. New scandals had taken its place, as they always do. Ethan was no longer a household name. He was a headline long forgotten, serving his time in silence. Barbara had retreated from society, her grand parties replaced with the quiet of irrelevance. The Carter Empire, once untouchable, existed only as a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. Rachel, however, was not forgotten. Not by me. She had kept her promise. She hadn't written again, not since her last letter. But I had heard whispers from Maria, who still worked part-time at the clinic, where Rachel answered phones. She said Rachel was saving money, paying back debts, slowly building a life that was hers alone. "She's different now," Maria told me gently, humbled, but stronger. I didn't chase after her. I had learned that love is not pursuit. Love is presence, waiting with open hands but never closing them into fists. And so I lived my life. I tended the garden, read books I had long postponed, and even began mentoring young women at the community center, teaching them the basics of business, of building something from nothing. Sharing my story with them healed parts of me I hadn't realized were still wounded. They looked at me not as a discarded mother, but as someone to learn from. And in their eyes, I rediscovered myself. Still, there were nights when I sat at my desk, my journal open, rereading Rachel's final letter. The paper was worn at the edges, the ink softened by my touch. Each time I read it, I found new strength in her words, and I whispered the same promise. "I'll be here." On the anniversary of her wedding, a day that had once felt like a knife, I decided to walk to the small cafe near the train station. I sat by the window, sipping tea, watching strangers move through their lives. Couples argued, children laughed, workers rushed by. Life pulsed forward, indifferent to my memories. And then, through the glass, I saw her. Rachel. Her hair was shorter now, her clothes simple but neat. She carried herself differently, not with the arrogance of someone chasing approval, but with the humility of someone who had learned how to stand on her own feet. She paused outside the cafe, looking uncertain, almost as if deciding whether to enter. Our eyes met through the window. For a moment, neither of us moved. The world around us blurred, and all I saw was my daughter. Older, changed, but still mine. She raised a tentative hand, the smallest of gestures, yet it carried the weight of a year's silence. I placed my palm gently against the glass, answering her without words. She didn't come inside, not yet. She smiled faintly, almost shyly, and then continued walking, her figure disappearing into the crowd. But that smile, oh, that smile, was enough. It wasn't reunion. It wasn't forgiveness wrapped in declarations. It was something simpler, something purer, a signal. 1 year after losing everything, she was still here. And 1 year after being cast aside, so was I. The roses in my garden would bloom again, and perhaps so would we. I finished my tea, heart steady, and whispered to myself, "It's never too late." There are words that follow us through life, like threads weaving through every joy and sorrow. For me, those words were simple. Silence is not weakness. It is power held in waiting. I had whispered them to myself on nights when Rachel's rejection felt unbearable. I had clung to them when Ethan tried to crush me with arrogance. And now, a year later, they returned to me with new weight, as if time itself had carved them into stone. One afternoon, I was asked to speak at the community center where I had been mentoring young women. They wanted me to share not just my business knowledge, but my story. The story of building, losing, and standing again. I hesitated at first. Telling pieces of my life aloud was different from writing in my journal, different from the quiet safety of memory. But I agreed, sensing that sometimes our stories are not just for us. They are for the ones still wandering, still searching for their own strength. The room was small, filled with women of all ages. Students, single mothers, women starting over after divorce, women who had been silenced in their own ways. I stood at the front, my hands resting lightly on the podium, and for a moment, the past washed over me. The wedding where I was cast aside, the words that cut me to the bone, the empire that crumbled under greed. I began softly, my voice steady. I am Diana Moore, 70 years old, a widow, a mother. For much of my life, people thought silence meant I had no voice. They mistook my quiet for weakness. They thought ignoring me would erase me. But let me tell you something. Silence, when chosen, is not erasure. It is strength. It is the pause before truth reveals itself. As I spoke, I felt the words gathering momentum, like waves pulling forward. I told them about Ethan, not by name, but as the man who tried to use deceit as a weapon. I told them about Rachel, not as a villain, but as a daughter lost in illusions of power and approval. And I told them about myself, about the nights when loneliness felt heavier than bricks, about the mornings when I chose to rise anyway, about the day I realized that my worth did not depend on anyone's invitation or approval. The women listened in silence, their eyes fixed on me, and then I gave them the line that had followed me, the echo that defined my journey. Silence is not weakness. It is power held in waiting. Do not mistake enduring quietly for surrender. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to answer cruelty with noise. Sometimes the act of standing still, of waiting, is what brings the storm down around those who underestimated you. I saw tears in a few eyes, nods rippling through the room. They understood, not because my story was theirs, but because pain and endurance are languages without borders. Afterward, as I packed up my notes, a young woman approached me. She was barely 20, with calloused hands and tired eyes. "Your words," she whispered. "They felt like mine. My family calls me useless. They think I'll never build anything. But maybe silence doesn't mean I'm broken. Maybe it means I'm waiting for my moment." I placed a hand on hers, steady and warm. "Exactly," I said, "and when your moment comes, you'll be ready." Walking home that evening, I thought of Rachel. She had not returned fully, but her smile through the cafe window lived in me like a spark. And I realized then that my thematic line was not just mine. It was hers too, though she did not yet know it. Silence had carried me through betrayal. Silence had protected me from despair. And perhaps, one day, silence would guide her back to me, not as the daughter who cast me aside, but as the woman who discovered her own power in the quiet. And so the line echoed once more, not as lament, but as promise. Silence is not weakness. It is power held in waiting. The story of my life does not end with scandal, betrayal, or even with loss. It continues quietly, like the steady ticking of that old clock in my living room. 1 year, then another, seasons folding into each other. My hair has grown whiter, my steps slower, but my spirit feels lighter than it did when I was 60. Because now I understand something I didn't then. Survival is not the same as living. And living begins the moment you stop apologizing for existing. Rachel has not yet returned fully. She lingers at the edges of my days, in letters tucked into my journal, in glimpses across crowded streets, in the faint echo of her smile through a cafe window. Some might call that unfinished. To me, it is possibility. The door remains open, the silence between us no longer heavy with rejection, but softened by hope. I do not need to know when she will step through. I only need to know that if she does, I will be here, not erased, not diminished, but whole. When I look back, I see the arc of my story clearly. I built something out of nothing. I gave until I was emptied. I was humiliated by the very child I raised, told to leave as if I were disposable. And yet, I endured. I stayed. I let silence be my ally. And in the end, it was not anger or shouting that restored my dignity, but patience, truth, and the quiet certainty that worth does not need anyone's permission. Sometimes I ask myself what lesson my story carries. Perhaps it is this: you cannot control the choices of those you love. Children may stray, spouses may betray, friends may disappear, but you are not defined by their treatment of you. You are defined by how you choose to stand afterward. Do you crumble into the dust they scatter over you? Or do you rise, shaking it off, and walk forward with your head unbowed? I have chosen to rise. And if you are listening to my voice right now, if my story has reached you across distance, across screens, across the private chambers of your own heart, I want you to remember this. It is never too late. Never too late to reclaim your dignity. Never too late to begin again. Never too late to tell yourself that you matter, even if no one else ever said it. Because I am not special. I am simply a woman who refused to disappear. And if I can endure and rise, so can you. The roses in my garden are blooming again. Their petals will wither in time, yes, but next spring they will return, just as they always do. That is the rhythm of life. Loss and renewal, endings and beginnings. The scars remain, but so does the beauty. I sit now with a cup of tea, the steam curling upward like prayers into the quiet air, and I whisper the words that have carried me through every season. Silence is not weakness. It is power held in waiting. And so, my story ends here, not with finality, but with invitation. To you who hear me, what would you have done if you were in my place? Would you have forgiven? Would you have walked away? Would you have fought louder? Or would you, too, have chosen silence? I ask because stories are not just for telling. They are for sharing, for weaving into the fabric of our collective memory. My story is mine, yes, but in some way, it is yours too. So, if you have ever been dismissed, underestimated, or cast aside, let my journey remind you, you are not alone. And if you have ever endured in silence, let my voice tell you, your silence holds power, even if no one else can hear it yet. And if you feel moved, leave your thoughts below. Share your own story, your own silence, your own beginning again. Because sometimes healing begins not in solitude, but in community. This is not the end. It is simply the next chapter waiting to be written.